gracias, really. It's a pleasure to be back in Barcelona and to be with you. Now, the question that I was asked to address is Turkey between tradition and modernity. So what I intend to do with you today in my almost 20 minutes, if you bear with me, is to give you a sense of what is Turkey's claim to fame. What makes Turkey different? What is valuable in the Turkish context? And this, I want to do it with the perspective of speaking at EMED, which is the prestigious institution looking at the whole Mediterranean world. So my perspective, if you want, is to share with you from my own understanding about what's valuable in the Turkish experience and to what extent that can actually be transposed in the Mediterranean setting, especially with regard to the Arab world. Now, 3 years ago, when the Arab Spring started, I don't know if you still call it spring in this part of the world, but that's how it was called a while ago. There was a lot of interest in Turkey, and rightly so. There was a lot of interest because it was believed that Turkey's own experience had a value for the countries that were just on the verge of transitioning towards a more democratic order. And I'm part of the people who has really been trying to give momentum to this analysis. I wrote back in those days a paper entitled From Inspiration to Aspiration, Turkey in the New Middle East, where I detailed what I believed the Turkish model was and to what extent it would be relevant for the rest of the region. Now, before coming here, I was also asked to be prepared to answer questions that relate not only to this historical context, which I will be sharing with you, but also to the current events in Turkey. But I'd rather postpone that and to the Q&A period. If you really have questions about what's going on nowadays, I'd be happy to answer them. But for the work that EMED does, I think it was more important to really address this issue about the main parameters of the Turkish experience. And here, I would like to refer to one of the popular books lately, which was about the noise and the signal. I don't know if any of you heard that or read the book. It's really about another way to say it, it's really about the structural and the conjectural. What is structural in what you're looking at, whether it's a country, whether it's a part of history, whether it's an institution, and what's conjectural? What will come and go, what will disappear in time, and what will remain in place? Now, that's a terminology that's mostly used by financial analysts, and the good financial analysts make a good living out of it by trying to weed out the signal from the noise. That's how they get rich. The ones who can really, look at an event and understand what's the signaling value of that as opposed to the noise, which is, more random, more chaotic. Now, us poor analysts, we don't get rich by doing that. We just increase our intellectual credibility if we are able to capture the essence of what is structural as opposed to what's conjectural. That's what I mean by signal and noise, and that's what I'll try to do with you today. Try to weed out, try to underline what's structural, what the signal is, what does the Turkish experience tells you in terms of a signaling effect, as opposed to the noise of everyday politics. So now let me go back to what the structural is. In that paper that I've referred to, with many others, and I will engage in a bit of self-propaganda here. If you look at Wikipedia, look at the Turkish model, they have borrowed my terminology of what the Turkish model is. So, I close my parenthesis about self-propaganda, and tell you about, in my perspective, what the Turkish model is. The 5 essential parameters that define the Turkish experience are the following. 1, secularism and democracy and the interaction between those two. 2, civil-military relations. 3, market-state relations. 4, Turkey's linkages with the West. And 5, Turkey's imperial legacy and its state tradition. Now, writing a paper and speaking about it are different things. Now, when you write a paper, you have ample time, you have perhaps not much of a limitation on the number of sentences that you will use. So it's somewhat more easy to construct all of this. But speaking about it, you're always faced with time pressure. So instead of walking you through all these elements, I will refer you to the paper, but I will just focus on the 3 of those, which I think has more of a bearing for the Mediterranean region. So I will talk about secularism and democracy. I will talk about market-state relations. And I will talk about the linkages with the West, which is all components of the Turkish model. Looking back at the Turkish experience, I will argue that there has really been 4 major points in the past century. As you know, this year, I don't know if it's the right term, but we are commemorating the 100th year of the First World War. So you are going to be seeing many events shaped around, what did we learn from the First World War, what's the legacy of the First World War. But one legacy of the First World War is actually Turkey. Because the Eastern question, as it was then, relates to the dismantling of one of the last empires in this region, the Ottomans. And Turkey emerged as a modern nation state, built on the ashes of a dismantled Ottoman Empire. An empire that had ruled over many continents and had remained in existence for over 5 centuries. That's a long time, 5 centuries. It's such a long time that despite now being almost a century away from us, from my generation, from your generation, it still has a big impact on the national consciousness of Turks. So much so that losing the empire has been a big trauma, which to this day, believe it or not, affects the way Turks see the world. It affects everyday politics. Now that's something very difficult to relay to an audience, to a foreign audience, to an international audience. I mean, you can argue that Spain, a big nation, also lost an empire. But I would find it hard to believe that today's Spanish politicians still fret about losing the Americas. That, that loss still influences the way they perceive the world and influences their policies. Exactly the opposite is true in Turkey. That trauma of losing an empire remains with us to this day and influences the policies. Also, another difference between the Spanish Empire and the Ottoman Empire is that losing a continental empire seems to be a different sort of tragedy than losing an offshore empire. It seems to be a much bigger tragedy in terms of the human suffering that it involves, that it has triggered, as opposed to losing an offshore empire. And that's why that loss is indelibly etched in Turkey's collective memory, and it's difficult to erase it. Now, the founders of the modern Turkish Republic, starting with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, were very well aware of this. And the way that they designed the modern state of Turkey attests to the dangers that they saw in this trauma, in revitalizing this trauma of the past. So what they did is to enshrine principles that would force Turks to look forward and not behind. Not to the past, but towards the future. And that, imagine, in a context where many states in Europe at the time were pursuing revisionist policies, not forward-looking, not future-looking policies, but revisionist policies. Think about Germany. Think about others. Think about the post-Versailles environment in Europe. Whereas the founders of modern-day Turkey did exactly the opposite. They articulated and they implemented policies almost to cut Turkey's relations with the past so that the Turkish population could look forward. One fundamental feature of those policies is secularism. The principle of secularism, which entered Turkey's constitution back in 1936, is one such tool, one such policy designed to cut Turkey's relationship with its past. That's at least, one of the main political goals that the founders of the republic, starting with Atatürk, aim to achieve with secularism. Turkey is the first Muslim country to adopt this principle, 80 years ago almost. And that remains one of the core components, one of the core features of what Turkey is today. At the margins, there are certainly moves to somewhat revision it, somewhat change it, amend it, fine-tune it perhaps, if you really want to be optimistic about what's going on. But that remains one of the core features of what defines Turkey. Now, you can argue, I think, and it would be legitimate to argue, that over the years, the very severe way that secularism was implemented, which, for instance, led to the prohibition of young girls wearing headscarves in universities, had to be amended, and it was amended. So today we have a rather different interpretation of secularism, but it's still a principle that is very much wedded to the concept of what Turkey is and the way that the Turkish state functions. The second part of this is democracy. Turkey transitioned to multi-party democracy back in 1950. Therefore, almost 25 years before Spain. The reason why Turkey transitioned to multi-party democracy is linked to this vocation that the founders gave about trying to make Turkey a full, genuine partner of the West, a full member of the West, however you define the West. So in the post-World War II era, Turkey's one of the main objectives of Turkish policymakers has been to place Turkey firmly in all the institutions, European institutions and transatlantic institutions. And the price to pay for that, in a way, was an early transition to democracy. Some claim, and there are some very prominent thinkers, one of them is Huntington. He claims in his book about political order in changing societies that the problems that some of these countries, specifically Turkey, faces today may be related to an early transition to democracy. And his argument is that when you transition to democracy, when most of the society is still very much embedded with pre-modern values, these can be religion, these can be kinship, these can be communitarian values, this can be tribal relationships, then the functioning of democracy is somewhat hindered by this. So his policy prescription is to try to modernize these values first before transition to democracy. But the Turkish experience demonstrates the opposite. And perhaps some of the problems that we face today, which I'll come back to, may be related to that. The third part of what makes Turkey unique, valuable, is its relationship with the West. Because Turkey is again the first Muslim country that sought to establish a parity relationship with the West. And that's quite different. That's quite different because that's the post-World War environment. But in the post-World War II environment, with the period of decolonization, the new states that came into being, all their political ideology has been very much shaped by an anti-West discourse, which continues to shape some of their outlook and their positioning in the world. Whereas for Turkey, that's not been the case. For Turkey, the approach has been, we are not going to be criticizing the West because we are the West. We want to be part of the West. And we want to establish a parity relationship with the West. And that's really been the driving force of some of the initiatives on the side of Turkish policymakers. So between the war era, Turkey became a member of the League of Nations. After the World War II, Turkey became member of almost all the European institutions, founding member of the Council of Europe, member of OECD, member of NATO. And the only, if you want, difficult case in this respect has really been the relationship with the EU. But even there, Turkey was the second country after Greece. The Rome Treaty, 1957. In 1959, Turkey and Greece decided to negotiate with what was then called the EEC. And first the Athens Agreement of 1962 and then the Ankara Agreement of 1963 were concluded. Those are the first two association agreements of the EU, of the EEC, which was then a club of 6 nations. The 7th was Greece, and the 8th country having established an association was Turkey. So Turkey's relationship with what was then called the EEC dates back to 1963, almost 50 years ago, and it's still ongoing. And within this territory, this geography of European institutions, that really is the only institution that Turkey has not acceded to yet, the outcome of which is pretty much uncertain at this point in time. We can discuss it, but nonetheless, what we can at least say is that that relationship, even though it hasn't yet led to accession, nonetheless has been very instrumental, very critical, very critically so, in defining Turkey's both democratic but also economic progress in years past. Now the situation is slightly different. The EU has lost a lot of its credibility in Turkey, a lot of its leverage, and that's certainly not good either for Turkey or for the EU. The fourth point that I would like to mention is the market-state relationship, what makes Turkey different. When you read about Turkey, one of the sort of qualifications that you come across is how vibrant of an economy it has. And indeed so. In the past 10 years, the average growth rate was 5.5%. And this is essentially due to the right formula, if you want, that Turkish policymakers have been able to devise in relation to the market-state relationship. One turning point is 1980, when there was a wave of liberalizing reforms. Another one is 96, with the completion of the customs union with the EU. And finally, the 2001 economic reforms form the basis that allow the Turkish economy to prosper. Within that, if you want, area are two sub-themes that I would like to underline, especially given their relevance to all of you, but also to the Spanish economy. One is the belief now among the Turkish population, and especially among Turkish youth, that they are in control of their future, that they should not rely on the state to give them opportunities to enhance their future. So I go to universities in Turkey, talk to many of the youth, and really what strikes me, compared to many other European countries, how Turkish youth have a belief that they're the ones that they should create their own future. They're not looking anymore at the state to provide jobs. They're out there, they're willing to take risk, they're willing to really implement their entrepreneurial spirit. And that's quite, that's quite novel to somebody like me who have, looked at Turkish history. And by the way, just a week ago, I was talking to a group of World Bank regional directors who had their meeting in Turkey. So these are World Bank directors who came from Northern Africa, Middle East, and Eastern Europe. And one of them asked me when I was telling them mostly about the Turkish economy and underlining this fact that, Turkish youth now had a very important volition of free enterprise. They were entrepreneurs. They liked this idea. They wanted to do more of it. Is, what's the origin of this? Is it historical? Because from their perspective as well, they're trying to understand what is replicable in the Turkish model for the Arab world. And my answer was, no, it's not historical at all. In fact, Turkish tradition, in the Ottoman tradition, Turks never entered into, I mean, that's a very strong word, but very few of them actually entered into business life. For Turks, the career move was to be military, part of the Ottoman, or part of the Ottoman administration. Those were the career paths of Turks. It's essentially the minorities that controlled the business environment under the Ottomans. So when the Ottoman empire was dismantled and Turkey came into being, we had very few entrepreneurs because most Turks were either soldiers or administrators. And it's only after many years of trying to implement this that the spirit of entrepreneurship flourished in Turkey. And it did flourish. And now it's very vibrant. You see that almost everywhere. So I think that's really the good news, that entrepreneurship can be nurtured. It doesn't have to be in the DNA of a nation. It wasn't in our DNA. It can be nurtured, and it can certainly become and acquire the vibrancy that it has acquired in the Turkish economy today. And the second sub-theme of this market-state relation is competition. With the opening up of the Turkish economy to the rest of the world, with trade policy reform, with customs union with the EU, this shifted the set of incentives of the Turkish business community. Before, business was about capturing the state and extracting economic rents from the state. Production licenses, import licenses, so on and so forth. That period ended completely. So now the incentive, there is no incentive anymore, except a few, to capture the state for economic rents, because the state doesn't really distribute economic rents anymore. So now, instead of that, there is a firmly held belief in competition. And that also tended to push the Turkish economy towards a more competitive marketplace. So for me, the Turkish model is essentially a byproduct of the interdependencies and the cross-fertilizations between these four principles: secularism and democracy, free market economics, and especially the market-state relationship, and Turkey's vocation to be a parity player with the West, and its whole foreign policy that is based on this vision. So if there is going to be transposability, replicability of what Turkey has accomplished, I think one needs to look at much more in detail on how these four principles have interacted between each other and how they have been applied in practice. Now, that certainly goes way beyond my task of today, but I think that's what's really required. It would be too simplistic to assume that you can actually transpose this principle as a block. But you really have to look not only at these individual principles, which I think was the more intellectually easy way to look at it, but it's wrong. I think the interactions between those principles is very important to catch, to really understand what's going on. So, despite the difficulties that Turkey has today, I genuinely believe that Turkey deserves credit for creating a model that by and large works, that has helped Turkish people to raise their standard of living under democratic rule. That needs to be recognized. Now, the challenge facing Turkey today, you're all interested, I'm sure, since you're here. You've been reading the news coming out of Turkey lately. So, the challenge first facing Turkey today is really to achieve its transition from perhaps a democratic order that can be characterized as a ballot box democracy to a genuinely free and liberal democracy. That is what is going on. That is how I at least read the current developments in Turkey. And this year is going to be an important year in that respect because there are at least 2 elections. And the outcome of those elections will determine the pace of this transition towards a more liberal democratic order. My main regret in all of this, although I'm optimistic by nature, so I think Turkey will end up in the good place, but my main regret in all of this is that unlike Spain, Turkey cannot fully profit from the EU and the positive impact that the EU can have on this process. When you look back at the Spanish experience, the invaluable role that the EU has played, when it helped Spain to embrace fully democratic principles, when it helped Spain to transform itself into a genuinely liberal democracy, that role is not today in the offing for Turkey. That is my main regret. So for us who've tried to build a better democracy back at home, we're basically left at our own devices. The EU leverage, the EU influence is quite minimal. So we are left to engineer, to find ways to overcome domestic difficulties. This is a statement of fact. It's not a statement of despair in any way. As I said, I believe we are, despite all these vulnerabilities, which, going back to the beginning of my speech, I still view them as noise, not as signals. What I try to share with you are the true signals about where Turkey was and where Turkey is going on the basis of the core principles of what makes Turkey today. What we're going through today, we're going through a turbulent period, but it's essentially noise. It's not signaling. So with these words, let me thank you, Javier, for inviting me and for allowing me to share my analysis at the other end of the Mediterranean.